The Last Hearth Before the Wilds. A Ranger's Rest Tale. Chapter 1. The first arrow struck the pine beside Corren Hale's head, hard enough to throw splinters across his cheek. He heard the bowstring a fraction of a second before the impact, and that small warning was probably the only reason the arrow had found wood instead of the hollow beneath his ear. Corren dropped without thinking, hit the wet slope on his shoulder, and slid through ferns and rotting needles until the trunk of a fallen cedar stopped him. A second arrow passed through the place where he had been standing. He lay still behind the cedar, listening. Rainwater dripped steadily from the branches overhead. Somewhere downhill a jay shrieked, then abruptly went quiet. Beyond that there was nothing but the slow movement of wind through trees older than most kingdoms. Then a horn sounded. One low ugly note rolled through the forest. Another answered from somewhere farther west. Corren closed his eyes and rested his forehead against the wet bark. Damn! They had spread out. He had hoped the river would slow them, or at least force them into a tighter column, or he might lose them among the rocks or take them in single combat. Instead, the goblins had crossed somewhere above him, and were now working both sides of the valley. They knew these woods, and were cunning. Corren had been moving since before dawn and running for much of the night before that. His cloak was torn nearly to the shoulder, blood had dried black along the sleeve of his mail shirt, and every step reminded him that the sole of his left boot had begun separating somewhere around the second river crossing. He had 6 arrows remaining in his quiver, though one had cracked behind the head, and would probably shatter if he loosed it from a full draw. 5 good arrows, then. His pursuers numbered perhaps 20, maybe more. He had killed enough of them that the number should have been smaller, yet every time he thought he had broken free, another horn answered somewhere in the trees. Corren reached beneath his shirt. His fingers found the object tied against his chest. It was a small cylinder, no longer than his middle finger and surprisingly heavy for its size, made from a dark metal he had first taken for tarnished brass. After carrying it for 3 days, he was no longer certain. Brass warmed against the body. This did not. No matter how long it remained beneath his shirt, the thing always felt faintly cold. There were no hinges and no obvious means of opening it. Both ends had been sealed with black wax impressed with a mark Corren did not recognize. A crown above what might have been a gate, or perhaps 2 towers joined by a bridge. Around the middle ran a narrow band of tiny lettering in a language he could not read. He had tried, more than once. The merchant at Harrowford had tried as well. The merchant was dead now. So was Captain Vale. So were 4 men from Vale's company, a ferryman, and a farm boy whose only mistake had been pointing Corren toward the northern road. That was a great deal of dying for an object small enough to disappear inside a closed fist. Corren had considered throwing it into the river. He had considered burying it. Once, during the worst part of the night, he had even considered breaking the wax and finding out what was inside. Captain Vale's last words had stopped him.
Get it north.
The captain had been lying beneath an overturned wagon when he said it, one hand pressed against a wound that Corren knew no surgeon could mend.
Find the antler.
Then Vale had caught Corren by the front of his mail with surprising strength.
Whatever happens, don't let them open it.
Corren had asked who they were. Vale had died before answering. He had been tracked by goblins for 3 days since he had taken the cylinder, and Corren was beginning to think he had found at least part of the answer. A twig snapped uphill. He released the cylinder and slowly reached for an arrow. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Corren raised himself just enough to see over the fallen cedar. Nothing moved. He waited. There. A patch of brown appeared between 2 enormous pines, perhaps 40 yards uphill. It vanished, then appeared again several yards closer. Corren nocked an arrow and drew. A goblin stepped from behind the tree. It stood a little under 5 feet, but was broad through the shoulders, wrapped in overlapping pieces of boiled leather painted with crude white markings. A rusted iron cap sat low over yellow eyes. The creature carried a short spear in one hand and was studying the ground. Corren settled the arrow behind its jaw. The goblin looked up. He released. The arrow struck just beneath the chin and drove upward. The goblin collapsed without enough breath left to make a sound. Corren was already moving when something screamed behind him. He turned as a spear struck the cedar and buried itself deep enough to quiver. 2 more goblins came through the brush. The first carried a hooked chopping blade, while the second crouched behind a round shield made from several planks bound together with iron straps. Corren shot at the shield-bearer. The arrow struck wood and stuck. The goblin barked something that might have been laughter. Corren dropped the bow and drew his sword. It was not a knight's weapon. There was no jewelled pommel, no maker's mark, and no prayer etched along the fuller. It was simply 30 inches of good steel with a leather grip polished smooth by years of use. The first goblin swung for his face. Corren caught the hooked blade against his crossguard, turned it aside and stepped forward before the creature could recover. His forehead struck its nose with a wet crack, and when the goblin stumbled he cut once across the neck. Black tar-thick blood spattered across his face as he turned on the shield-bearer. The shield struck him before he could bring the sword back. Corren went over the cedar log and landed hard on his back. His sword disappeared somewhere among the ferns. The goblin came over the log after him. Corren kicked upward with both feet, caught the edge of the shield and managed to turn the creature, just enough that its knife missed his throat. Then it was on top of him, one knee driving into his chest while both of Corren's hands fought to keep the blade away from his face. Its breath smelled of rotten meat. The goblin smiled.
Those who enter never return.
Spittle spewed from its mouth. Corren stared at it for a moment, surprised despite himself. Then his left hand released the goblin's wrist. The creature immediately drove downward. Corren turned his head, felt the knife cut the edge of his ear, and brought his hunting knife up beneath the goblin's ribs. The smile disappeared. He drove the blade deeper. The goblin sagged against him. Corren shoved it aside and lay in the ferns, breathing. Another horn sounded from somewhere behind him. Much closer this time, he found his sword, then he ran north. The rain arrived around midday, although calling it rain gave the weather more dignity than it deserved. It was a cold drizzle that never fell hard enough to mask his tracks, but soaked everything thoroughly enough to make the rocks treacherous and the moss heavy with water. Corren climbed steadily. He did not know this country, and that bothered him almost as much as the goblins. A man who spent enough time outdoors learned that forests had personalities. Some were open country wearing trees, easy to read and easier to cross. Others were tangled places that resisted travellers with thorns, bogs and deadfall. This forest was different. It felt old. Ancient cedar and pine rose around him like the columns of some roofless temple, many of them so broad that 3 men joining hands could not have circled their trunks. Moss-covered stones the size of cottages. Fallen trees became bridges over ravines, and new trees grew from the decaying bodies of the old. The farther north he travelled, the less evidence he saw that men had ever been there. Sometime before noon he crossed what remained of an imperial road. That worried him. He pulled the map from inside his cloak and unfolded it beneath a cedar. The old road was easy enough to find. It ran east to west across the parchment in faded red ink. North of it there was almost nothing. Mountains, forest, a river without a name. And near the upper edge of the parchment someone had scratched a tiny antler. Corren ran his thumb over the mark. He had first noticed it 3 weeks earlier while sitting across from an old merchant at Harrow Ford. Vale had already told him to find the antler, but neither man had known what that meant until the merchant saw the captain's map. The old fellow had stopped smiling.
"You ever find yourself north of the old road,"
he'd said,
"and dark's coming, you look for that mark."
Corren had tapped the parchment.
What is it?
The merchant had poured himself another drink.
"The last Hearth."
That a town?
"No."
A fort?
The old man had looked toward the tavern door before answering.
"Better."
Corren had tried to get more from him. He hadn't. The merchant had been dead the next morning. Now Corren folded the map and started climbing again. A horn sounded far to the south. He kept moving. He found the first antler an hour before sunset. An arrow had been driven into the trunk of a cedar nearly 20 feet above the ground. It was old enough that bark had begun growing around the shaft, but beneath it someone had carved the simple outline of an antler. Corren stopped. He approached the tree slowly and touched the carving. So Vale had known what he was talking about. For the first time in 3 days, Corren felt something dangerously close to relief. "You're loud." Corren froze. The voice had come from above him. A man's voice. Calm. Corren looked into the branches. Nothing. "You're bleeding, too." Another man, this time somewhere behind him. Corren's hand moved toward his sword. An arrow struck the ground between his boots. He stopped. A strip of dark green cloth had been tied beneath the fletching. "Leave the sword where it is," said the first voice. Corren looked slowly around the forest.
You could simply come down and ask.
"We could?"
Are you going to?
"No." Corren considered that.
Fair enough.
"Walk north."
And if I don't?
There was a short silence, and then the second man said, "You'll probably be dead before the goblins get here." Corren looked toward the voice.
That sounds unfriendly.
"It's been a long week." Despite himself, Corren smiled. He started north. For the next half-mile, he saw no one. Once he heard a branch shift high to his right. Another time he caught what might have been the edge of a grey-green cloak disappearing behind a cedar. Whoever they were, they moved through the country as if they had been born from it. Then Corren began noticing the things he had missed. Branches had been trimmed where they might interfere with a bow. Small stones rested in unnatural arrangements beside the trail. A thin cord ran ankle-high between two bushes. He stopped over it. The trail widened. Ahead stood a weathered post. An antler had been carved deeply into its face, and beneath it were words worn smooth by years of weather. "Rest for those who come in peace." Corren read them. Then something moved behind him. He turned too late. A goblin erupted from the ferns. This one was much larger than the scouts he had fought earlier, with iron plates strapped across its shoulders and a long-handled axe raised over its head. Corren got his sword up just before the axe fell. Steel crashed against steel. Pain shot through his injured arm and drove him to one knee. The goblin wrenched its axe free. Corren knew he would not stop the second blow. An arrow appeared in the goblin's throat. The creature staggered. A second arrow struck beneath its arm. Then a third buried itself almost to the feathers in its chest. The goblin remained standing for a bewildered moment. A fourth arrow struck its eye as it fell backward. Corren looked into the trees. A man stepped from behind a cedar. He was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with a beard that had begun going grey along the jaw. A dark green cloak hung over worn leather and mail, and the longbow in his hands was already drawn again. He wasn't aiming at Corren, he was aiming past him. Down! Corren dropped. The forest erupted. Men appeared where a moment earlier there had only been trees. 6 of them, maybe 7. Arrows hissed through the rain. Goblin cries answered. Corren rolled behind the trail marker as several shapes charged through the undergrowth. One goblin fell almost immediately. Another staggered forward with an arrow through its thigh, before a second struck its chest. The third reached the rangers. A broad-shouldered man in a grey cloak stepped forward to meet it. Instead of a sword, he carried a short woodman's axe. He avoided the goblin's spear, stepped inside its reach and buried the axe beneath its arm. The return stroke ended the fight. More shapes moved among the trees. The patrol had found him. Corren drew his sword. The grey-bearded ranger glanced at him.
You able to use that?
I've been managing.
Then keep managing.
The goblins attacked. What followed lasted less than a minute, though Corren remembered it afterward as a collection of separate moments. An arrow passing close enough to his cheek that he felt the air move. A goblin coming through the rain with a chipped sword raised over its head. Corren parrying, turning and cutting into its thigh. The grey-bearded ranger shooting it before it reached the ground. Another goblin lunging from the left. Corren turning too slowly. A ranger stepping between them and driving a short spear through its chest. "You watch that side," the man said. Corren turned, sword in the low guard, as there were too many arrows flying about. He glanced over his shoulder at the ranger, who had his cloak flung back over his shoulder, short sword drawn, ready to strike or grapple. He hadn't realised how much he'd missed fighting beside men who knew what they were doing. The remaining goblins finally broke. Several disappeared south into the forest. The broad ranger with the axe raised one hand. Nobody pursued. Within moments, the woods were quiet again. Corren leaned on his sword and breathed. The broad ranger walked among the bodies, counting.
13.
3 got away, someone said. A bowstring sounded from somewhere far to the south. A few seconds later came a faint cry. The grey-bearded ranger tilted his head.
2.
Corren looked at him.
Another sentry.
West Watch.
How many of you are out here?
The man smiled slightly.
Enough.
Then his eyes dropped to Corren's chest. During the fight, the leather thong had slipped free. The dark cylinder hung outside his mail. The ranger's smile vanished.
Where did you get that?
Corren covered it instinctively.
Captain Vale.
The broad ranger turned. For a moment neither man said anything. Then the grey-bearded ranger looked back at Corren.
Vale sent you?
He told me to find the antler.
The two men exchanged a glance.
Captain Vale is dead?
The broad ranger asked. Corren nodded. The man's jaw tightened. He looked south toward the bodies scattered beneath the trees. Then he rested the axe across his shoulder.
You'd better come with us.
Chapter 2. Ranger's Rest was not what Corren had expected. He had imagined a stockade, perhaps a stone tower commanding some narrow mountain pass. Instead, hidden in a clearing between two forested ridges, he found an inn. A very large inn. It stood beneath trees that seemed tall enough to hold up the evening sky, built from dark timber and riverstone, with moss covering much of the steep roof. Several chimneys sent wood smoke curling into the drizzle, and warm lanterns hung beneath a porch that stretched almost the entire length of the building. Horses occupied a covered stable. Someone was splitting wood behind the kitchen, and somewhere inside, faint through the walls, a fiddle was playing. Corren stopped.
This is Ranger's Rest.
The grey-bearded ranger walked past him.
You disappointed.
I was expecting a fortress.
The ranger looked back.
It is.
Corren studied the building again, then he began to see it. The hill behind the inn had been terraced in places where the undergrowth should have grown naturally. Firing positions. The second-story windows were slightly too narrow. Arrow slits disguised as ordinary windows. The heavy timber around the porch concealed a stone wall almost waist-high. The stable blocked the easiest approach from the east, while anyone coming from the south would have to cross nearly 70 yards of open ground. Every path into the clearing overlapped another. Corren gave a quiet whistle. The ranger smiled.
Now you see it.
Inside, the rest was warm enough to hurt. A stone hearth dominated the common room, large enough that a man could have stood upright inside it. Venison turned on an iron spit while wet cloaks steamed from pegs along the wall. Rangers occupied several tables, hunters another. Two merchants argued over dice near the bar while a group of men in muddy boots listened to the fiddler in the corner. Conversation continued when Corren entered, but almost everyone looked at him. The grey-bearded ranger pointed toward an empty table.
Food?
Yes,
Ale?
definitely.
Bath?
Corren looked down at himself.
Eventually.
The ranger sniffed.
Sooner than eventually.
A bowl appeared in front of Corren. Venison stew, potatoes, onions, fresh bread. He stared at it for a moment before eating. Someone placed an ale beside him. He drank half the mug without stopping. Only then did the ranger sit opposite him.
Name's Bram Alder.
Corren Hale.
I know.
Corren stopped chewing. Bram took a drink.
How?
The goblins know.
That took some of the pleasure out of the meal. Bram leaned back in his chair.
They weren't hunting a random traveler, Corren Hale. They were hunting you.
Corren touched the cylinder beneath his shirt.
I had gathered that.
Do you know what you're carrying?
No.
Good.
Corren frowned.
Everyone keeps acting as though ignorance is some great advantage.
Recently it has been.
The broad ranger entered the room, still carrying his axe. He took the chair beside Bram.
Harlan.
That appeared to be the entirety of his introduction. Corren nodded.
Hale.
Harlan looked toward his chest.
The cylinder.
No.
Bram hid a smile behind his mug. Harlan studied Corren for several seconds.
Vale told you to bring it here?
He told me to find the antler.
You found it.
He didn't tell me to hand it to a man named Harlan.
Harlan's expression remained unreadable. Then he laughed.
Vale chose well.
He stood.
Finish your food.
Corren tore off another piece of bread.
Then what?
Then you get the answer to the question that's been chasing you for 3 days.
Corren looked down at the cylinder beneath his shirt.
And after that?
Harlan's expression changed.
After that, you decide whether you want to start running again.
The room beneath Ranger's Rest was older than the inn. Much older. Stone steps descended beneath the wine cellar into a chamber cut directly from the bedrock. Harlan carried a lantern while Bram followed behind him, leaving Corren to bring up the rear. At the bottom stood an iron door. Harlan unlocked it. The room beyond contained almost nothing, except a map. It covered an entire wall. Corren stepped closer. He recognized the southern kingdoms, the Imperial Road, and the river he had crossed 2 days earlier. Then the map continued north, farther north than any map Corren had ever seen. There were mountain ranges beyond mountain ranges, forests without names, ruined roads, old fortresses, and entire regions labelled in languages he did not recognize. And near the upper edge was a black circle. Corren stared at it.
What is that?
Harlan did not answer. Instead, he held out his hand.
The cylinder.
Corren hesitated and then removed it.
Open it.
Corren looked at him.
Vale told me nobody should open it.
He told you they shouldn't open it.
That was true. Corren broke the black seal. The wax resisted at first and then cracked with a surprisingly sharp sound. Inside was a tightly rolled strip of vellum. Corren unfolded it. 7 words had been written across the page. The north gate is open. The king lives. Corren read them twice, then a third time.
That means nothing to me.
It will,
Bram said. Harlan approached the map and pointed toward the black circle.
312 years ago, the last king of the Northern Realm marched through that gate with 9,000 men.
His finger moved north.
None of them returned.
Corren looked at the vellum.
300 years?
312.
Then whoever wrote this is either mad or lying.
Possibly.
Harlan reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. A coin. Corren picked it up. A crowned stag had been stamped into one side. The other bore the face of a bearded man wearing a narrow crown. The metal was bright, new.
What am I looking at?
That coin arrived at Ranger's Rest 6 nights ago.
Who brought it?
A boy.
Where is he?
Buried behind the east ridge.
Corren slowly placed the coin down.
Where did he get it?
Harlan pointed north.
Beyond the gate.
For a while, the only sound in the chamber was the faint crackle of the lantern. Corren thought about Captain Vale beneath the wagon. The dead merchant, the ferryman, the goblins, all of them connected somehow to 7 words written on a scrap of vellum.
What do the goblins want with this?
Bram shook his head.
We don't know.
You people seem remarkably comfortable saying that.
It keeps us alive,
Bram said. Harlan rolled the message carefully.
We're sending a party north tomorrow.
Corren laughed. Neither ranger did. His smile slowly disappeared.
You're serious.
6 rangers. 2 mountain guides.
And?
Harlan looked at him.
You?
No.
You carried the message.
I delivered the message.
You survived 3 days with a Blacktooth patrol hunting you.
Barely.
You crossed 40 miles of wilderness alone.
I was running.
Bram leaned against the table.
Sometimes that's the same thing.
Corren shook his head.
No.
Harlan nodded.
Fair enough.
That surprised him. Harlan walked toward the door.
Your room is upstairs. 2nd door on the left.
Corren remained beside the map.
What happens if I don't go?
Harlan stopped.
Nothing.
That's it?
You eat. You sleep. Tomorrow you take the southern road.
And you?
We go north.
Harlan climbed the stairs. Bram followed. At the doorway, Corren called after him.
Bram.
The ranger stopped. Corren looked toward the black circle.
What is beyond the north gate?
For the first time since Corren had met him, Bram seemed to have no easy answer. Finally, he looked back toward the map.
Nobody knows.
A small smile appeared beneath his grey beard.
That's why we're going.
He disappeared upstairs. Corren stood alone. Above him he could hear laughter from the common room. The fiddle had started again. Mugs struck tables, boots crossed floorboards, and somewhere above all of it the great hearth cracked and popped. Outside, rain whispered against the roof. Corren looked at the map, then the coin, then the black circle. 300 years. A vanished army. A dead king who apparently wasn't dead. Goblin patrols and agents of evil killing anyone who learned otherwise. Corren sighed. He had been looking forward to going south. Dawn came grey and cold. 8 horses waited outside Ranger's Rest. Harlan tightened the strap beneath his saddle, while Bram counted arrows into a fresh quiver. 6 other men moved around them, checking tack, tying bedrolls and dividing supplies without much conversation. There was no 9th horse. Bram looked toward the inn.
5 copper says he comes.
Harlan pulled the saddle strap tighter.
3 silver says he doesn't.
You're terrible at gambling.
So are you.
The door opened. Corren stepped onto the porch wearing a clean shirt beneath his mail and a dry cloak over his shoulders. His sword hung at his hip. He was carrying a mug of ale. Bram raised an eyebrow.
Bit early.
Corren finished it and handed the empty mug to the innkeeper.
Long road.
The innkeeper passed him a pack. Corren slung it over his shoulder. Harlan watched him.
You sure?
No.
Good.
Corren walked toward the stable.
Which one's mine?
Harlan pointed toward a brown gelding. Corren mounted. Behind them, smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of Ranger's Rest. Warm yellow light still filled several windows, and above the porch an antler had been carved into an old timber darkened by a century of rain. Ahead, the northern trail disappeared beneath the ancient trees. Bram brought his horse alongside Corren's.
There is one thing you ought to know.
Corren adjusted his reins.
What?
When we reach the north gate, don't touch anything.
Corren looked at him.
That seems oddly specific.
Bram urged his horse forward.
Don't tell me later I never warned you.
One by one, the rangers entered the forest. Corren remained behind for a moment. He looked back at the inn, at the smoke rising above the trees and the warm windows beneath the moss-covered roof. After 3 days of being hunted, it was the first place that had felt safe. Above the entrance were 2 words, Ranger's Rest, the last hearth before the wilds. Corren turned his horse north and followed the rangers beneath the trees. Somewhere far beyond them stood a gate that had swallowed an army 3 centuries ago, and according to a message men had already killed to possess, someone on the other side had finally opened it. End of part 1.